The doors swing open, and there she is, standing behind the steel counter in a hairnet and an apron dusted with flour, steam rising behind her from the kitchen. She looks up, and before you even say a word, she says your name. Not next, not you, your name. She remembers it. She remembers what you like, and whether you took seconds last Tuesday. That's the cafeteria. That's 1970s America. Right there in a room that smelled like tomato sauce and boiled green beans and something warm baking in the back. Somewhere on this list is the lunch lady who knew every kid in that line by name, long before anyone called it customer service. She's coming. Hold on to her. And somewhere else on this list is a dish so mysterious, so gray, so gently terrifying that generations of kids still argue about what was actually in it. They called it meatloaf. Nobody was ever fully sure. It's coming too. But before we get there, we have to talk about what disappeared, because somewhere between then and now, something happened to the school cafeteria. The trays got replaced, the lunch ladies retired, and most of all, kids stopped eating together, at the same time, in the same room, off the same menu. Lunch became something you brought from home, ate alone, ate fast, ate without anyone asking your name. Nobody meant for that to happen. It wasn't a villain in a boardroom. It was convenience, one packed lunch bag at a time. But something got lost in that trade. A room full of kids, learning to sit together, was quietly emptied out. If you remember standing in that line, if you remember the sound of 200 trays clattering at once, hit subscribe before we start, because this next hour is going to bring all of it back. 25 things from the 1970s school cafeteria that you haven't thought about in decades. Let's start at the bottom of the list and work our way up to the one thing almost every American your age remembers instantly. Number 25. Cleaning your tray and stacking it on the way out. There was a rhythm to it. You finished eating, and then you got up, tray in both hands, careful not to slosh the last of your milk. You scraped whatever was left into the big gray bin by the door, the smell of 100 half-eaten lunches rising up all at once. Then you stacked your tray on the pile. Careful, because if it slipped, it clattered, and everyone turned to look. Nobody taught you this in a classroom. You just learned it by watching the kid in front of you. It was one of the first systems you ever belonged to, a small piece of order in a very loud room. That stacking station is mostly gone now. Cafeterias moved to disposable trays, then to kids eating out of paper bags at their own desks. No line, no stack, no shared cleanup at all. It seems small, but that little routine taught a whole generation how to take care of a shared space, quietly, without being told. You knew exactly where your tray went, and so did everyone else. Nobody needed to remind you twice. Number 24. The water fountain by the cafeteria door. Ice cold and free. If you didn't want milk, that fountain was your only other option, and by some accounts, it was the coldest water in the entire school. You'd bend down, hit the button, and feel that first shock of cold hit your teeth. Kids lined up for it after recess, breathless, waiting their turn, wiping their mouths with the backs of their hands. There was no bottle, no brand name, just a steel spout and a stream of water that tasted faintly of the pipes and, somehow, of summer. Bottled water changed that. Vending machines changed that. Somewhere along the way, that free steel fountain by the cafeteria door stopped being the only choice, and eventually it stopped being noticed at all. That water didn't cost a thing, and it still tasted like something. Number 23. The heavy metal silverware that clanked like a drumline. These weren't the flimsy plastic forks kids use today. These were real metal forks and spoons, thick-handled, a little dented from years of use, and they weighed something in your hand. When 200 kids sat down at once, the sound of that silverware hitting metal trays was almost musical. A clatter that meant lunch had officially begun. Old-timers remember the cafeteria staff counting every fork and spoon back in at the end of the line, making sure none went missing, because that silverware was meant to last years, not minutes. Plastic utensils are cheaper, and they don't need washing, and so the heavy metal forks quietly disappeared from most school kitchens. What went with them was that particular sound, the sound of an entire cafeteria settling in together to eat. You could hear lunchtime start before you even smelled it. Number 22. The thick plastic tray with its own built-in compartments. Before we get to the tray everyone remembers most, at number 1, there was this one, the everyday workhorse. Hard plastic, usually beige or that faded institutional green, with molded sections for your main dish, your vegetable, your bread, your milk carton. It was scratched from years of dishwashing, sometimes a little warped from the heat, but it never quite broke. You could tell which lunch line had the good trays and which had the ones with a crack down the middle that pooled your gravy into the corn. These trays got run through industrial dishwashers thousands of times over a school year, and by some accounts, a single tray could serve a school for the better part of a decade before it finally cracked for good. Disposable trays and prepackaged meals eventually made that kind of durability unnecessary. Why wash something 1,000 times when you can throw it away once? That tray outlasted 3 or 4 grades of kids passing through the same line, quietly doing its job the whole time. Number 21. The paper lunch menu that came home in your backpack. Once a month, sometimes once a week, you brought home a mimeographed sheet, purple ink, slightly smudged, listing exactly what the cafeteria would be serving each day. Your mom taped it to the refrigerator. You'd scan it the second you got home, circling the days that mattered. Taco day, pizza day, the day with the good rolls. That little sheet of paper did something quietly important. It let a whole family plan around the school day. It told your mother whether to pack you something or trust the cafeteria that day. It gave you, a kid, something to look forward to on a Tuesday. As school food services centralized and went digital, that paper menu on the fridge slowly disappeared, replaced eventually by websites nobody checked and apps nobody opened. The ritual of circling the good days quietly went with it. You knew what Thursday was going to taste like before Thursday ever came. Number 20. The bell that meant lunch was over, whether you'd finished or not. You'd hear it cut through 200 conversations at once. A bell or a buzzer that didn't care if you were mid-bite. Chairs scraped back all at once. Trays got grabbed. Somebody's milk carton tipped over in the rush, and nobody had time to help clean it because the bell meant move, now. There was no negotiating with that sound. Old-timers remember gulping the last of their milk standing up, tray already halfway to the trash, because the bell didn't wait for anyone. Lunch periods have gotten more staggered and flexible in a lot of schools since then, spread across longer windows, less of a single dramatic cutoff for an entire grade at once. Efficient, maybe. But it took away that shared little moment of urgency, the whole cafeteria rising together at the exact same second. For 30 seconds, every kid in that room moved like one single animal. Number 19. Cornbread pulled warm from the cafeteria oven. You could smell it before you saw it. That faint, sweet corn smell drifting out from the kitchen 15 minutes before the line even opened. When it hit your tray, it was still warm enough to melt the little pat of butter the lunch lady dropped on top, and you learned fast that the corners were the best part, a little crisp where the pan had browned them. Nobody remembers a recipe card for it. It was just what the cafeteria made, from whatever ratio the cooks had used for years, passed down cook to cook, rather than written down anywhere official. Pre-packaged bread products and shrinking kitchen staff eventually made that kind of made-from-scratch baking rare in most school kitchens. The smell that used to drift down the hallway before lunch even started quietly stopped happening. Someone in that kitchen got up early enough to bake bread for 400 kids, and most of them never knew her name. Number 18. Tater tots, golden and crisp, piled onto every tray without fail. They came in a scoop, a little mountain of them, crispy on the outside and soft in the middle, and there was an unspoken rule that you ate the crunchiest ones first before they went soft under the gravy. Some kids traded 3 tater tots for half a cookie without a second thought. That was the going exchange rate on most days. By some accounts, tater tots became a school lunch staple, partly because they were cheap, fast to bake in bulk, and endlessly reheatable, everything an institutional kitchen needed in one small crispy package. They're still around in a lot of cafeterias today, but the scoop and serve version, made and portioned by hand in an open kitchen, has mostly given way to pre-bagged, pre-measured portions straight from a freezer truck. The tots survived. The kitchen behind them didn't. Some things never really left. They just stopped being made by someone who knew your name. Number 17. The smell of the cafeteria kitchen, thick and unmistakable, hitting you before you even reached the doors. It was a particular smell, a mix of steamed vegetables, simmering tomato sauce, and something baking, all of it hanging in the hallway long before the doors opened. You could smell Tuesday from 3 classrooms away, and know, instantly, what was coming. That smell meant something. It meant the whole school was about to eat the same thing, at the same time, together. Old-timers remember that smell as almost a kind of school clock, more reliable than any bell. As cafeterias shifted toward pre-packaged, reheat-only meals, that thick, all-day cooking smell faded in a lot of schools. The smell of food actually being made, from scratch, in real time for hundreds of kids, quietly became rare. You could tell what day it was with your eyes closed. Now here's the thing worth sitting with for a second. In the 1970s, that cafeteria wasn't just a place to refuel between classes. It was, for a lot of kids, the 1 hour of the day built entirely around being together. No assigned seats most days, no lesson plan, just 400 kids in one room, eating the same food, at the same time, figuring out who to sit with. The lunch lady wasn't just cooking. By some accounts, she was often one of the few adults in the building who wasn't grading you, testing you, or disciplining you. She was just feeding you, and asking how your day was going. That mattered more than anyone realized at the time. A shared meal, eaten in public, with the same faces every single day, taught kids something no classroom could. How to belong to a room. We didn't know to miss it. We just knew that room, that smell, that noise, felt like ours. Number 16. A bowl of vegetable soup with little elbow macaroni floating in it. On the coldest days of the year. You could tell it was a soup day the second you walked in because the whole cafeteria felt warmer somehow, steam fogging up the metal counter where the lunch ladies ladled it out. Carrots, celery, a little bit of ground beef, and always those small macaroni noodles that softened just enough to slide right off your spoon. It wasn't fancy. Nobody would have called it gourmet. But on a January day with snow still on your boots from recess, that bowl of soup was exactly what your body wanted, and somehow the whole cafeteria knew it, because everyone got quiet and just ate. As cafeterias moved toward faster, more standardized menus, from scratch soup, simmered for hours in a big kitchen pot, became one of the harder things to keep on the rotation. It takes time nobody's kitchen budget really allows anymore. That soup didn't need a name on the menu. Everyone just called it Soup Day, and everyone knew what that meant. Number 15. Red or green gelatin, jiggling in a small paper cup next to a single plain cookie. It was rarely fancy, sometimes a little too firm, sometimes a little too soft, but it was dessert, and dessert was dessert. You'd poke it with your spoon before eating it, just to watch it wobble, because that was half the fun. The cookie next to it was usually plain, sometimes a little stale, but nobody complained because it came free with the tray. Old-timers remember trading their gelatin for someone else's cookie almost every single day, an unofficial currency that ran the entire lunchroom. As dessert offerings became more varied and pre-packaged, that specific pairing, jiggly gelatin plus one plain cookie, quietly stopped being the default. It's not that dessert disappeared, it's that this exact, humble little combination did. Nobody remembers what flavor it was. Everybody remembers exactly how it wobbled. Number 14. Trading half your sandwich for someone else's cookie, right there at the table, no adult ever involved. This was the real economy of the cafeteria, quieter than any vending machine, more honest than any store. You'd hold up half a bologna sandwich, someone across the table would hold up a Twinkie, and a deal got struck in about 4 seconds flat, no words needed most days. There were rules to it too, unspoken but firm. You didn't trade something you hadn't offered to your best friend first. You didn't complain if the trade went bad, and everyone knew which kid always had the best stuff in their lunchbox, and which kid you could count on to trade fair. As school lunches became more individually packaged, and as awareness around food allergies grew, that casual trading at the table became rarer, sometimes actively discouraged by schools trying to keep track of what kids were actually eating. Something practical, sure, but that tiny daily economy of trust between 10-year-olds quietly went away with it. You learned to read people at that lunch table long before anyone taught you the word negotiation. Number 13. Sitting at the exact same table, with the exact same group, every single day without ever discussing it. Nobody assigned those seats, nobody wrote your name on a spot, but by the second week of school, everyone just knew where they sat, and if a new kid sat there by accident, everyone felt it, an unspoken little earthquake at the table. That table became its own small country, its own jokes, its own rules, its own history that only the kids sitting there understood. You could tell someone's whole social world by asking one question: who do you sit with at lunch? Cafeterias today often move faster, with more staggered schedules and less consistency in who's even eating at the same time as you. That daily, unspoken ritual of claiming a table and holding it all year has gotten harder to hold on to in a lot of schools. You never had to ask where you belonged. You just walked in, and your feet already knew. Number 12. Asking the lunch lady for seconds and holding your breath while she decided. You'd walk your tray back up to the counter, a little sheepish, and ask if there was any more of whatever the good dish was that day. Sometimes she'd smile and pile on an extra scoop without a word. Sometimes she'd shake her head, out, sorry, and you'd walk back to your table a little disappointed but never really upset. There was no system to it, no rule written down anywhere. It ran entirely on her judgment, her mood, how much was left in the pan, and honestly, sometimes on whether she liked you. Old-timers remember certain lunch ladies who always found a little extra for the kids who said please, and other days where the answer was just no, and that was that. As portion control became more standardized, driven partly by nutrition guidelines and partly by cost tracking, that personal, case-by-case decision about seconds mostly disappeared from cafeteria lines. Everyone got exactly what the tray said they got. Back then, getting seconds felt like a small personal favor from someone who ran the whole room. Number 11. The sound of an entire cafeteria eating lunch at once. Hundreds of voices layered on top of each other. It wasn't one sound. It was a wall of them. Trays clattering, chairs scraping, somebody laughing too loud 3 tables over, a teacher's whistle cutting through for just a second before the noise swallowed it right back up. If you stood at the doorway before finding your seat, that noise hit you like a wave. By some accounts, teachers who'd worked in schools for decades said the cafeteria was, hands down, the loudest room in the entire building, louder than the gym, louder than recess, because it was the one place 400 kids were packed shoulder to shoulder with nothing structured to do but talk. As lunch periods became more staggered across smaller groups, and some schools introduced quieter, more controlled eating environments, that specific roar, the sound of an entire grade eating together at full volume, became rarer. That noise meant you weren't alone. 400 kids were proof of it, all at once. There's something worth pausing on here. Somewhere in the late 70s and into the 80s, the shift really started. Parents, worried about nutrition, worried about cost, worried about their kid eating something they didn't recognize, started packing lunches from home instead. It made sense on paper. More control, more choice, food you trusted because you packed it yourself. But something quieter happened alongside it. Kids started eating different things, at different times, sometimes alone at a corner of the table with a bag from home, while everyone else ate off a tray. The cafeteria slowly stopped being one shared experience and started becoming hundreds of small, separate ones. Nobody decided to end the ritual. It just got chosen away, one packed lunch at a time. It wasn't all bad, what came after. Some of it was healthier, some of it gave families more say. But that specific feeling, of 400 kids eating the exact same thing at the exact same moment, is something we didn't realize we were trading away until it was already gone.
Number 10. The day's menu, written out in chalk or marker on a board right at the cafeteria entrance.
You'd see it before you even got in line, a hand-lettered sign propped up near the door, telling you exactly what today held. Sometimes it was good news, pizza day, taco day, the day with the good rolls. Sometimes it was a groan, mystery casserole, again. Either way, you knew, and you braced yourself accordingly. That board wasn't printed anywhere. Somebody on staff wrote it fresh most mornings, sometimes with a little doodle next to the good days, a smiley face by the pizza, nothing next to the days nobody looked forward to. As menus moved online and got standardized across entire districts, that handwritten sign by the door, personal, a little uneven, clearly made by someone who worked in that building, mostly disappeared. The information's still out there. It's just not written by hand anymore. You could read your whole day's mood off that board before first period even started. Number 9. Standing in a long line that snaked halfway across the cafeteria, tray in hand, waiting your turn. It moved slow, always slower than you wanted, especially on pizza day when word had already spread that it was going fast. You'd shuffle forward a few inches at a time, trading small talk with whoever was next to you, watching the steam rise off the trays ahead as they got filled. By some accounts, that line was where a lot of friendships actually got built. 10 minutes of standing shoulder to shoulder with the same kids, day after day, nothing to do but talk. Cafeterias have changed a lot of serving styles since, some going to multiple stations, some to grab-and-go setups that cut the wait time down considerably. Efficient? Sure. But that long, slow shuffle, the one that gave you 10 minutes of nothing to do but talk to whoever was next to you, mostly went with it. 10 minutes of standing in line taught you more about your classmates than most class periods did. Number 8. Chocolate milk in a small waxed paper carton, with a paper straw that always went soft halfway through. You'd peel back the little cardboard flaps, sometimes fighting with them for longer than felt reasonable, and pour it, or drink it straight from the carton if the lunch lady wasn't looking. The straw was paper, and by the last few sips it had usually gone soft and started to collapse, so you learned to drink fast or switch to just tipping the carton back. That carton was cold in a very particular way, colder than the room, colder than anything else on your tray, condensation beating on the outside within a few minutes of sitting down. Milk is still served in most cafeterias today, but the waxed cardboard carton with the fold-out top has largely given way to plastic, and the paper straw gave way to plastic ones long before paper made its recent comeback elsewhere. The exact object in your hand changed, even if the drink didn't. You knew exactly how many sips you had before that straw gave out completely. Number 7. Beans and cornbread, served together, almost as if they were one single dish rather than two. It showed up on the menu more than almost anything else. A scoop of beans, soft and a little sweet, next to a square of cornbread that soaked up the juice if you let it sit too long. Some kids crumbled the cornbread right into the beans. Others kept them separate until the very last bite. Both camps had strong opinions about which way was correct. It was cheap to make in bulk, filling, and by some accounts one of the few dishes that almost every kid in the cafeteria actually finished, no matter what else was on the tray that day. As menus diversified and cafeterias moved toward more variety week to week, that specific, humble, almost weekly pairing became far less of a fixture. It's not gone from every cafeteria, but it stopped being the reliable, almost daily thing it once was. Some days, the whole tray was just an excuse to get to that square of cornbread. Number 6. Homemade chocolate pudding, still a little warm, served in a small metal or paper cup. This wasn't the store-bought kind you'd find in a plastic cup at the grocery store. This was made in the cafeteria kitchen that same morning. Thick, a little grainy in the best way, sometimes with a thin skin on top that some kids peeled off and some kids ate first on purpose. It was warm enough, most days, that you could smell the chocolate before the cup even reached your tray. Old-timers remember certain lunch ladies whose pudding got talked about across the entire school, kids from other grades asking their friends what today's cafeteria was serving, hoping the answer was pudding. As cafeterias moved toward pre-made, shelf-stable desserts that didn't require a kitchen staff cooking from scratch every day, that specific, still warm, slightly imperfect homemade pudding became one of the harder things to find. The chocolate pudding on shelves today usually never touched a stove in that building. Somebody stood over a pot that morning, stirring, just so 400 kids could have something warm and sweet at the end of their tray. Number 5. Fried chicken with French fries, the one meal that made the whole cafeteria go quiet with focus. You could smell it from down the hall, and word always spread fast. Chicken day, whispered kid to kid before first period even ended. The chicken came golden and crisp, sometimes a little greasy in the best possible way, and the fries next to it disappeared faster than almost anything else on the menu. By some accounts, Chicken Day emptied entire lines faster than any other meal of the week, kids racing to make sure there was still a good piece left by the time they reached the counter. As menus shifted and fried foods became less of a daily fixture due to changing nutrition standards, that specific, beloved combination became a once-in-a-while treat in a lot of schools rather than a regular occurrence. It didn't disappear entirely. It just stopped being something you could count on showing up soon. For one day a week, the whole cafeteria agreed on something, and that something was Chicken Day. Number 4. The lunch lady who knew your name, your order, and usually your day before you said a single word. You'd get to the front of the line, and before you could even ask, she'd already be reaching for the tray she knew you'd want because she'd served you 11 times that month already and she paid attention. If you looked a little down, she noticed that too, and sometimes slipped you an extra roll without saying why. She wasn't paid to remember 400 names. She just did. Old-timers remember specific lunch ladies decades later, by name, longer than they remember most of their substitute teachers, because she was one of the steady adults in a building full of change. As school staffing shifted, and cafeteria work became more standardized and often contracted out to larger food service companies, that specific, personal relationship with the same person serving you every single day became far less common in a lot of districts. The food kept coming. The person behind it changed more often and knew you a little less. She wasn't just handing you lunch. She was quietly telling you every single day that somebody in that building saw you. Number 3. The deep dish rectangle of cafeteria pizza, cut into squares instead of triangles. It came out of a giant sheet pan, thick crust, a layer of sauce that always seemed a little sweeter than what you got at an actual pizzeria, and a blanket of cheese that stretched in long strings the second you pulled a piece free. It was cut into squares, always squares, never triangles, and somehow that made it feel like its own separate category of food entirely. Not quite pizza, but close enough that nobody argued. By some accounts, Pizza Day consistently ranked as the single most popular meal on the entire monthly menu. The one day even kids who usually brought lunch from home asked their parents for cafeteria money instead. As cafeterias modernized and some brought in actual pizza chains or pre-made frozen versions, that specific thick, square, slightly too sweet cafeteria pizza became rarer, replaced by something closer to the real thing but somehow less specifically its own. It wasn't the best pizza you ever had. It might be the one you remember most. Number 2. The mystery meatloaf. Gray, dense, and endlessly debated. Nobody ever really knew what was in it. It came out in a thick slab, a little gray around the edges, sometimes with a shine of gravy poured over the top to help it along. Kids poked at it before eating it, some out of suspicion, some out of ritual, and there was always at least one kid at the table who refused it on principle and traded it away before the tray even hit the table fully. But here's the thing almost nobody remembers correctly. By some accounts, that meatloaf was often made from a genuinely decent recipe. Ground beef, breadcrumbs, onion, held together and stretched to feed hundreds of kids on a tight budget. It just didn't look like the meatloaf your mother made at home, and looks, at that age, were everything. As cafeterias moved toward foods that were easier to identify and market to kids, dishes that looked mysterious, however good they actually tasted, mostly disappeared from the rotation. Nobody serves mystery meatloaf anymore. They serve chicken nuggets, with a name and a shape everybody already trusts. It became a joke, decades later, at reunions and family dinners. But somewhere under the jokes, somebody was trying to feed you well on a school district's tight budget, and mostly succeeding. Before we get to number 1, it's worth sitting with something. None of this was perfect. The food wasn't gourmet. The trays were scratched, the meatloaf was strange, the lines were slow, and by some accounts, more than one kid went home complaining that lunch was awful that day. Nobody's claiming the 1970s cafeteria was some kind of golden age of cuisine. But something else was happening in that room, underneath the food itself. 400 kids, eating together, at the same time, off the same tray, served by someone who knew their names. That wasn't about the meatloaf. That was about belonging to something bigger than yourself, every single day, without ever having to try. We didn't lose that because someone decided to take it away. We lost it one packed lunch, one staggered schedule, one contracted-out kitchen at a time, each choice reasonable on its own. But add them all up, and an entire generation of kids grew up eating lunch a little more alone than the generation before them did. That's the real thing this list has been circling the whole time. Not the food, the room. And that brings us to number 1. The metal tray, with its own built-in compartments, dented at the corners, cool to the touch even when the food on it was hot. You knew this tray before you knew most of your teachers' names. It had a spot for your main dish, a smaller one for vegetables, another for whatever bread came with it, and a little round dent, just the right size, for your milk carton. It clanked when you set it down. It clanked louder when a whole cafeteria set 200 of them down at once. That tray had been through years of kids before you, and would go through years after. It absorbed the heat of the food and held it a little longer than plastic ever could. By some accounts, some of those trays were still in use decades after they were first purchased, dented, scratched, and somehow still standing. It wasn't fancy. It was never meant to be. It was built to be strong enough to last, and simple enough that every single kid in that school ate off the exact same design, no matter who they were or where they sat. Someone had decided you were worth feeding on something solid. Someone had decided a school lunch, even a modest one, deserved a real tray. Not something disposable. Not something that got thrown away the second you were done. That tray said, in its own quiet, dented way, that this meal mattered, that you mattered. We traded it for something lighter, cheaper, easier to throw away. And somewhere in that trade, we quietly let go of a room where 400 kids ate the exact same thing, off the exact same tray, together. If any of this brought you back, even for a minute, to standing in that line with a tray in your hands, tell me about it. What was on your tray back then? Did your lunch lady know your name? Was there a dish from your own cafeteria that never made this list, but should have? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and some of the best stories on this channel started as a comment just like the one you're about to leave. And if today's video brought back that feeling of the kitchen table, of a meal that meant more than just food, you'll want to see where we went last time. We covered 25 forgotten Great Depression recipes that saved American families, dishes born out of nothing, stretched to feed everyone at the table. It's right there, waiting for you, whenever you're ready to go back a little further.